I greatly appreciate him being here. We are joined with the one and only Michael Maloof,
How
man
you
of
doing,
the
Jamar?
hour, back
Good
from
morning.
traveling. How you doing, man? You doing all right this morning?
I haven't stopped. I'm great.
I was just like, you haven't stopped. Michael Maloof, he's a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst to RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. How you doing, man? You doing good this morning? Michael, can you hear me all right? I think he may be frozen. Don't worry. He will be back. We may just be having a bit of lag, but he'll be back and he is going to have a conversation about the insanity that is happening right now on the ground. One of the cases I want to bring up while we get Michael back. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, there you are. You were frozen for a bit. I'm sorry. This has been a bit of insanity. I have been royally freaked out by the way that they've been acting in the State Department, and for that matter, European leaders following lead of the State Department. The most recent thing is the firing off missiles into Russia, something that they've said is a red line. And I was watching a response to the Oreshnik missile strike in Ukraine, a weapon of terrifying destructive power. And I was looking at Europe and the US to figure out, okay, how are they taking this? Are they taking this with the gravity it deserves, like a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse? Or are they going to continue pushing the envelope? It seems that they're continuing to push the envelope. So apparently Le Monde is saying that French and the UK, or France and the UK, are talking about putting Ukrainian or troops in Ukraine. So there's that. You get the Biden administration that approved those missile launches into Ukraine, talking about putting JASSMs. They were even talking about putting nuclear missiles into Ukraine as a deterrent. And apparently, the Biden administration had legitimate conversations about fast tracking Ukraine into NATO. These people are insane. Give me your
Well,
take on this escalation. What do you think is going on in the Biden administration's mind? Do they think that Putin is bluffing, or are they just looking for a war? What's your thoughts?
well, I think they're in desperation because they have seen that their policy of long standing has failed, that they have everything that they have done has led us to a precipice of enlargement of a war. And frankly, Europe stands to lose the most because of the range of the intermediate range ballistic missiles. Very close by, they will have virtually no. They would virtually have no warning time. So if they want to start something, I think Russia will accommodate. They're in that. Russia is in the mood of taking no prisoners at this point. They have really made it very clear that red lines are not only being approached but violated, and they saw what happened back in February of 2022 when that red line was broached, and he's not, and Putin's not bluffing. Now, I don't think they'll resort to nuclear weapons. I think there will be just an increase. There will be an intensification of missile strikes into Ukraine proper, and any NATO participants inside of Ukraine then become fair game, and they will. And I think there's a holding period here. I think Putin is biding time till Trump is in, and when he has the power and authority to of the office to make decisions. And we're hoping that something tangible can occur. We're working. Some of us are working on efforts to not only bring about this effort toward a peaceful solution, but also to lay the groundwork for a ceasefire negotiation. It's going to be a long shot, but right now we don't see anybody in authority really doing anything of the sort.
Let me
And
ask you this though. I mean, I don't necessarily think that they would immediately escalate to nuclear war, but
no,
it's an escalatory spiral that I'm concerned about, where
no.
NATO's forces, let's say, lose on the ground. For example, Putin has said, even in his speech, if you are attacking us, you are legitimate targets, meaning
Right,
France, the UK, or for the matter, the United States. I
right.
mean, if they are putting troops in Ukraine, those people are going to be a tripwire. I mean, they're going to scream to high heaven when those troops get killed, because those troops will get killed. I guess my thing is, do they grasp that? Does the Biden does it seems that the Biden administration is trying to kind of escalate the conflict in the last 2 months, realizing that the jig is up. But do they believe Putin is bluffing? Do they think that he won't hit European targets? I mean, like what do you think is going on in their mind at this moment? I mean, because I take him at his word. I think he's serious. This stuff is existential from the Russian point of view. This is happening on their border. Um, and again, Ukraine has been used as a gateway of the West to attack Russia at the very least on 3 occasions, going back to Napoleon, the First World War, and the Second World War. They are not joking about their borders. Do you think that the Biden administration believes that he is bluffing? Because otherwise, I don't quite get this escalation in that context. Otherwise,
No, I don't think they believe he's bluffing. I just don't think that they believe that he will attack Europe per se. He will engage their troops, and we've seen this. French troops have been engaged in the past in Ukraine, were killed, and that has been revealed. Yet France still wants to send in more troops. Well,
yeah,
they're making a conscious decision. So NATO will never agree to taking on Russia as an alliance. It just will not do it.
but they're
You're
doing
going to
so
have
now. I mean, the firing
well,
missiles into Russia is them
but these are
effectively declaring
individual
war.
countries. These are individual countries. It's not NATO. It's what we call the countries of the willing, if
I
you
see.
will.
I see.
They then become they then open themselves up for direct confrontation. I think though that if Putin were to go ahead and start sending missiles into that NATO base in Poland, for example, without warning, that might trigger some NATO action. But when these countries enter into bilateral arrangements with Ukraine to a defensive alliance, and they're acting on their own, that doesn't bring in NATO at all. It does not activate Article 5,
Yeah.
which is, and also you have other countries you have 32 countries now in NATO, and you cannot get that mob of countries all to be unified in agreement on anything, and they're not going to go along with it. So individual countries are basically beginning to splinter off from a united NATO. It appears NATO is splintered, and I just think that this is the beginning of the end for NATO. And even Borrell is admitting that it may be the beginning of the end for EU because of their downtrodden economies due to the support of this hopeless war. So it's beginning to, but Putin is not bluffing, and I think that he will ratchet things up. He does things in a very deliberate way, and his people have no illusions about. Frankly, I will tell you this from what I'm hearing. I was just in Moscow.
Yep.
They have no illusions that things are necessarily going to get better under Trump, and I
Right.
think that this is one thing that is of concern, because a lot of folks are placing their hopes in the fact that that with Trump on board, it's going to be a whole new agenda and approach, and it depends. And a lot of folks are suggesting that it really depends upon who he's surrounded by, and actions, because they point to the fact that under Trump they suffered the greatest sanctions. Most of their properties in the United States were confiscated,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, you can make excuses. Well, he was under this pressure, under investigation for Russian collusion, and he had to give the appearance of being tough and all that. All of that now has gone away. Now we will wait and see precisely how he does act. Now he is talking about setting up a buffer zone. Well, who's going to police the buffer zone? Well, you can't get Zelensky. Is Zelensky on board? Not necessarily. If he decides to capitulate, he'll be dead within 24 hours. So he's, unless he scrambles to the U.S. or someplace, to Italy. But we're at a very dangerous period, and between now and the elections, it's a very dangerous time, not only in Ukraine but also in the Middle East. So we'll see what happens.
I do want to go to the Middle East for a moment, but I want to stay on this one just for a little bit longer.
Sure.
In Putin's speech, he effectively said any country that launches missiles into Russia has become a fair game and a legitimate target to the conflict, meaning France, the UK, or the US.
Right.
And assuming for the moment that you're right, that NATO is not going to get involved in its entirety. I mean, Germany, Scholz has come out effectively saying this is a horrible idea. So he seems to not be on board for what.
And Italy is opposed too. Italy
is also opposed.
Yeah.
Romania has just elected someone who seems to be a NATO skeptic. But from your take, though, what would push him to attack a NATO base? Let's say not in Poland, for example. Let's say whether it was France, Britain, or even some kind of base that the U.S. had at its disposal. What would legitimize an attack on one of those bases? Because I take it if he said it in his speech, he means it. And I imagine there's a certain level of tolerance that he's going to accept where he says, okay, screw it. They're not getting ahead. They're not taking us seriously, or they believe on some reason I'm bluffing. What would push him to do that from your point of view?
I think it's going to take a lot for this reason. I don't see NATO launching anything from a NATO base into Russia directly.
Okay.
I do see elements like we're seeing now of mercenaries and countries of the willing moving stuff in, and that means that he's just going to pulverize and intensify attacks inside of Ukraine. If these countries want to engage Russia directly, I can't see a Lithuania or a Poland going directly up against Russia. I mean, it would be total suicide. Then, if Russia's then attacked by these countries directly, then it's fair game. And then, would NATO rally? Probably not, because that NATO country broke ranks,
right,
and went on its own. Look, I think we're seeing the demise of NATO as an effective defense alliance. What I envision for NATO in time is that they're going to break up into small little regional defense alliances, like the Scandinavian countries. They'll do their little thing. But I don't see a unified. I mean, I don't see how you get 32 countries on the same page, considering the politics and what we're seeing and hearing right now. Right now, they're not unified in an approach against Putin. Many of these countries, including Germany, are against sending these longer range missiles into Russia. So there's disunity within NATO, and I think that what's his name, Putin can play them off that way.
I want you to play this clip. This is, I believe, a Rear Admiral, and he was asked about nuclear war. And the wild part about it is they don't seem to be taking nuclear war with the gravity it deserves. He is making this argument that, well, the U.S. needs to maintain supremacy. And if we believe that we can maintain supremacy in a nuclear war, then, we may be willing to engage in it. But listen to the argument that he's making here. This is utterly outrageous.
Talk about non-nuclear and nuclear capabilities. We certainly don't want to have an exchange, right? I think everybody would agree if we have to have an exchange, then we want to do it in terms that are most acceptable to the United States. So it's terms that are most acceptable to the United States that puts us in a position to continue to lead the world.
Terms that are acceptable to the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
This is.
You were there for that conversation.
Yes.
But terms that are acceptable to the United States to ensure that we can continue to rule the world. And it's like, but you're talking about a nuclear war. Like you're talking
Yeah.
about the end of all things. And he is like, yeah, as long as we end the world, as long as we are we have one man standing at the end of the world ending, then we are, this is okay.
It's
What's
it's
your take on this
insanity.
civil race?
It's insanity on steroids, and these, you see, this guy is so caught up in his in his job and his perspective that he doesn't see the forest for the trees, and doesn't realize the consequences. He's never experienced a nuclear war. Admittedly, I haven't either, but from what I can see, it's very devastating. Yeah, I don't want to even a tactical nuke, and not to mention the consequences of the spread of radiation throughout Europe. Look at the accident in Chernobyl. There, people, areas are still realizing the effects of that. So many years later, what was it, in '87?
Yeah.
And so they don't realize the consequences of their statements and or action, proposed actions. They just think it's another war game on a board, on a tabletop, and it's not. It's reality. And these countries, and as I said, Europe will sustain the greatest damage and suffering. It will not be necessarily the U.S.
Well, I want to go into that for a moment also. Am I wrong in thinking that the U.S.'s point of view, meaning if you were talking to someone who was whose job was to war game stuff out, let's say you were talking about a Brzezinski, for example, from their point of view, they think Europe would be the battlefield, that the U.S. would be able to have this kind of blissful distance from all of it, and that any fight that takes place on the European continent, if indeed it comes to a war. Am I wrong in that? Like, we're thinking that we're going to be safe and that Europe is going to take the damage and that we're going to fight this on the battlefields of Europe. Is that what they're thinking more than anything else? And is that true?
Well, I think the U.S. envisions the fact that they have established bases throughout Europe, that's where the action will be. They don't anticipate that it's going to be on the homeland, U.S. homeland. Yeah. So, I think the perception and the military planning is that it will be in Europe primarily, and that's what they have to guard against as the first line of defense. But that also means that Europe, once again, will sustain the greatest suffering.
Exactly. Does Europe know that? Meaning, if we're sitting in a room together, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, all of you are going to take the hit. Do everybody else know that that's what the U.S. is thinking? Meaning, the Starmer, Macron, Schultz, all of these people, do they know that from the U.S.'s point of view, you are going to get hit? It's going to be on you, that your territory is going to be devastated with us being further away from this. And
I think it's in the back of their. I think it's in the back of their mind, but they don't really have not come to grips with the reality that it can be so. They realize. I think they have the concept, but they haven't. They're not doing anything to mitigate, to try to steer away from that inevitability or that self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. It's one in which these people have now got serious things to weigh in Europe. They got economies their economy is about wrecked. Europe is in recession right now, right. And you got a winter coming. It's going to be a cold winter, and the majority of the German people, for example, are opposed to any further action with Ukraine. They tried, they failed. They now need to move on, and they I think they realize that the last thing in the world they need is a war with Russia, but that's what they'll get if they continue on this spiral.
Are you optimistic about, let's say, how things turn out? Like, meaning, do you see a way out of this? Do you see either any kind of turn, either in European politics or in American politics, that precludes us from continued escalation on this kind of escalatory spiral?
Yeah, in spite of the danger we're facing right now, I think there are points at which we can mitigate this and do things. But as long as you have a Biden administration that's purposely escalating to lock in Trump to the point where he has no choice but to arm Ukraine even further, that's bad. And I think it really demonstrates the evilness of the Democrats and in their thinking in what they're doing to set this man up for failure, setting Trump up for failure before he even takes office. And that's wrong. That is dead wrong. It's just another form of lawfare and another we got you type of thing, and locking him in, but not realizing the implications for the countries and the people involved. They're such elitists. They don't care about people. They only care about themselves, and they're demonstrating this day in, day out. And that's why the American people massively voted for change. And we'll see what happens. But I think there are some there are opportunities that we can do as long as Mr. Putin exercises restraint in his responses. Because frankly, the European countries are chickens. They're not going to go full bore because they don't have the support. They don't have a unified front, and you're seeing countries every day peeling off from any kind of unity. And I think that Putin needs to stay the course and what he's doing, and because everything that he's been doing, for example, sending the Orezhnik, and he can send swarms of those. He's got an inventory. If he sends swarms of those, the next time somebody wants to escalate something, then Ukraine will get it. They will, and even if it means hitting Kyiv itself. I don't think it'll extend into Europe, but frankly, all of his actions so far have been in response to Western escalation, and we got to keep that in mind. And that even goes back to why he even attacked Ukraine in 22, because of NATO expansion, in spite of his warnings and national security. I mean, the U.S. comes halfway around the world to block in and contain Russia. They have nowhere else to go, and Americans and the Democrats and Biden in particular just don't realize that it's all to support their ideology of ruling, of maintaining their rules-based order, a world rules-based order, and being the leadership of it, and it's cracking. And countries are falling off. And we're seeing this now with the developing countries, the global South. Putin has one other restraint from going nuclear, and that is the global South and the developing countries would really recoil at that notion. And he needs them now more than ever to build up this multipolar world order. So I think he has to weigh all of this, because the African countries, the Latin American countries do not want him to enter into a full-scale war or have a nuclear exchange whatsoever. So he's got a lot on his plate to consider, but the way the West is going about pricking him all the time, they're just pricks. It's not a threat to the Federation that would activate the use of nuclear weapons.
But see, therein lies the rub. It's a catch-22. It's kind of like it's a Hobbes choice. In fact, all of this has been a Hobbes choice. Either you allow us to overthrow the government of Ukraine and put it in NATO, or you take aggressive action in order to prevent it. And in this case, it's kind of like, okay, either you allow us to escalate up until the point that Trump takes office, even to the point of potentially putting in troops in Ukraine, or you take provocative action to prevent it. Both of those are impossible outcomes, if that makes sense. Like, meaning, if I'm remain pragmatic, you use my pragmatism as weakness and escalate in Ukraine. If I take aggressive action, then you scream and holler, oh my God, Russia is being aggressive, in which case we can now put troops in Ukraine, or for that matter, we can escalate further also. It seems that there's no way out that box. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Do you see a way out that box?
I just don't see U.S. troops with boots on the ground in the Ukraine. I just don't
Good.
see it. Europeans are opposed to it. Other Europeans are opposed to it. You may have individual countries, the extremists such as Poland and Lithuania,
But those are individuals.
who may, they'll do it on a bilateral, do something. But frankly, it's like this. I mean, Lithuania, Estonia, who's afraid of them? Russia's
Well,
not
I don't know
afraid
who's
of
afraid
them.
of any of them, to be honest. Like,
No,
I'm
he's not.
Yeah.
And yet they come out like their bravado. They hide behind these little munchkins hiding behind this big giant. But that big giant is not necessarily supportive.
Yeah, the
We
Estonian PM, she is humiliating. Like, she comes out and
Yeah.
puffs out her chest like somebody is scared of
Yeah.
Estonia.
Yeah, but the extent of her puffery is only measured by the extent of how much the U.S. will back her when push turns to shove, and if she initiates something, the U.S. isn't necessarily going to do anything.
She's on her own.
She's on her own because it's not NATO sponsored. It's not pushed by NATO. And the U.S. right now is in charge of NATO. Now, if these European countries want to go off and set up their own European defense alliance, so good for them. And Trump would probably be happy. And that way it keeps us out of wars.
Well, wait a minute.
Everything we're doing is fighting European wars all the time.
Well, see, that's the rub, though. Would Trump be happy with that? I mean, the United States has been against Europe doing that. From our point of view, we wanted to maintain this kind of military control over Europe, which NATO allows. And Joseph Borrell, I believe, even came out recently saying that Europe needs its own security architecture. Macron has come out every so often saying Europe needs to be able to have control of its own military, or for that matter, its own security. We have been, for the most part, against that. I mean, we don't want to lose control of Europe, which is what it boils down to. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Well, NATO is really a post-World War II structure. We've got to get out from. We have to emerge from that way of thinking. The world has moved on. We don't have direct threats any longer. We're trying to instigate one with Russia by declaring them to be the boogeyman in order to support our defense industry. But there's no basis for it. I mean, after the end of the Cold War, Russia turned westward, and we rejected them.
Right.
I mean, people have got to know their history. People don't know their history.
I played an interview with Jeffrey Sachs earlier today, and I let it play out, where he goes into chapter and verse, how it happened, how the breakdown happened, how Russia was literally looking westward, like meaning, these guys were looking to the West to be part of the Western structure, and we rejected them on it. I mean,
exactly. Well, Sachs is absolutely correct. But yet the American people don't realize it, and all of a sudden we're confronted, in our daily lives with this monster called a potential war, maybe World War III with Russia, and no one knows how we got there. All we know now is we got to find a way to survive it. People don't realize what led up to where we are today, and Sachs is absolutely correct. And Russia did not push this where we are today. And in fact, we don't see any evidence that Putin wants to take over Europe or do a blitzkrieg across Europe. We have the likes of Austin and Lloyd Austin and what have you trying to equate him with Hitler. But if you know your history, there's no similarity. There's absolutely no parallel.
Yeah, it's outrageous. I'm going to move to the Middle East, and I want to start in Lebanon. I've been fascinated with the stuff that have been coming out of the White House in relation to Lebanon. They continuously say, just like they did in Gaza, there's a deal on the table, we have a potential deal, and at no point was that to be true. And I would point out the same thing is happening in Lebanon right now, where we send Hashtin, who used to be an IDF soldier, into Lebanon representing the U.S. as Israel massacres and attacks the civilian population in Lebanon. That is outrageous on its face, right? And they're saying there's a potential deal. The deal that they're putting on the table is for the U.S. and for Israel to effectively take southern Lebanon. and even going so far as to say that Israel can make up their mind in regards to when they want to attack southern Lebanon with the U.S. help in doing so. Is Lebanon really going to accept that deal? I mean, there are a few parts to this that don't quite make sense. For one, the Lebanese military hasn't fired a shot in anger against the Israel military that has attacked Lebanon. It's been Hezbollah that has been fighting that conflict on the border in southern Lebanon to prevent Israel from invading. Are they, I guess, first question is, are they really on the brink of a deal, or is the White House and State Department lying about this again?
I think it's wishful thinking. Israel will not agree to a ceasefire. They've made it very clear they want to eliminate Hezbollah. They want to occupy the southern Lebanon. It's not going to happen, and Hezbollah will not move out of the south. I mean, they've occupied that area for years, right. And they have stiff resistance now. And the Israelis have made no advances into southern Lebanon. The only thing that Israel is now doing is resorting to air power and bombing central Beirut, killing hundreds and hundreds of very innocent people right now in the middle of Beirut, areas that I know quite well, and it's the resentment that they have built up now. They will, in our lifetime, there will never be peace with the Israelis.
Well, they're trying to say that they're trying to get the Lebanese government to agree to send Lebanese troops to southern Lebanon with the idea that Hezbollah pulls back out of southern Lebanon.
Yeah, it's just not going to happen. Hezbollah will not do it, and the Lebanese military is too weak. Even though they work hand in glove to some extent, and a majority of the Lebanese military, frankly, are Shia. They're going to go along with what Hezbollah wants.
Okay, so this deal is probably not necessarily going to take place.
I don't see it happening. And again, I think it's another case of wishful thinking, because we've seen this movie before so many times, where the White House tries to build something up as great and grandiose as about imminently going to happen. The Israelis have also got to agree to it, and they're not. The terms are not there. They want the destruction of Hezbollah. That's just not going to happen.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, because Seymour Hersh recently, it seems like what they're trying to do is to carve off Hezbollah from Gaza, to basically say, because the reason why I'm bringing this up, part of the reason or the rationale that Hezbollah use is what you're slaughtering and committing a genocide in Gaza, and our pressure on you and attacking you is to stop you from doing that. And if Hezbollah makes a deal on that, you've effectively isolated Gaza, allowing Israel to continue the massacre that's taking place in Gaza and in the West Bank. Smotrich and the government recently came out effectively saying they're going to annex the West Bank. And there's even a speech of Smotrich's calling for the depopulation of Gaza, arguing that we can create voluntary immigration. Basically, we're going to force those people to leave by creating a hellish environment that is so bad that they can't necessarily stay.
Where do they go? Where do they go?
That is the operative question. That is that question fascinates
me. They
me.
don't care. You see, the Israelis don't care. They have this Talmudic outlook that that everybody other than them are animals in human form, and they're just undertaking wanton slaughter and ethnic cleansing, basically, and all they want is to reclaim the West Bank, southern Lebanon, and all of Gaza, and as their own. They claim it's all their biblical right.
God gave it to them.
Yeah, God gave it. I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy, and you're going to see. And people are not going to buy into this, and I think that this is where the Sunnis are probably going to, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, are going to probably have to come in and basically back up the Shia on this, because we now see Saudi Arabia saying, if you want any stability in the region, especially with Israel, you got to agree to a two-state solution. Well, this is why Smotrich and company are effectively trying to eliminate that possibility by annexing the West Bank. And West Bank is one of the two elements for this two-state solution.
Well, that's the other interesting part to me. So if you talk to Israel, let's say Israelis, people that I've interviewed, and I would point out, okay, well, what about a two-state solution? They would say, no, we don't agree to a two-state solution. We don't believe in it.
Yeah.
It's not what we want. And then he said, okay, well, what about a one-state solution? And they said, well, that's not Israel. And so we don't want that either. And then, so my question is always, okay, well, what do you want? Like, what is it that you would accept? Because truth is, annexing the West Bank, okay, well, there are Palestinians there. So what happens to the Palestinians under the West Bank at the point where you annex the West Bank? And I'm going to ask you that. What happens to the Palestinian population the moment that the West Bank is annexed under Israel? I mean, it becomes an apartheid state. Well, it was already an apartheid state, but it becomes one in literal fact, meaning it becomes unarguable that it's an apartheid state under the model.
I think the Israeli notion is for the settlers to chase them into Jordan, and the Jordanians don't want them.
Right, the Jordans said no.
And the Egyptians don't want them. That's why you're going to have a standoff. That's why you're going to see a further rupturing. And this is all because the Zionists want a Jewish state,
right,
as opposed to living together as they did for 2,000 years beforehand, together, where you had Palestinians and Jews living side by side. And so it's going to be this becomes the major problem, the insolvable problem that we're dealing with. And Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are making matters even worse. It's going to bring in, I think ultimately it could bring in a united Arab front to ultimately extinguish the Israeli state.
Well, and to that, I want to add Trump. Because let's start at the beginning with Trump. The people who he's put in is basically an Israeli first policy.
Of course.
I mean, you can look at the people, right? Trump gets $30 million from Miriam Adelson. It was supposed to be $100 million, but whatever. It ends up being around $30 million. And so he has decided, I'm going to take an Israeli first policy. And I'm super curious on what that looks like in real terms, especially considering the world is different. Saudi Arabia and Iran have mended fences to some degree. Yeah. All of them are under BRICS. Iran has signed, or is going to sign, a security agreement with Russia in this case. So even if Trump wants to deal with Russia on, let's say, the most favorable view of it, that he wants to come in and make some kind of deal with Russia in the Ukraine war, any pressure attempt on Iran is going to run into that security agreement with Russia. How do you think this looks when Trump gets in with this kind of Israeli first policy, when the entire Muslim world at this point hates Israel for the genocide that they're committing? What does this look like in real terms?
Well, the world is much more complicated since Trump was in office the first time, and he's going to have to wake up to the reality. Now, I have a theory that Trump is probably going to look to Saudis in his second term, only because he's going to be looking for a golden parachute for Trump International and his kids, and that means real estate. And Saudi Arabia is very much involved in development now for their 2030 plan. And he wants to get in on that. But the Saudis are insisting, however, that to normalize relations at all with Israel, they all have to agree to a two-state solution. So I think he might start veering in that direction. He's done everything for Israel that Israel wanted in his first term, and realized that Netanyahu basically stabbed him in the back on a few occasions.
Well,
he basically undercut him. There were two instances where Netanyahu undercut Trump. But number one was that as soon as Biden won the 2020 election, he got a congratulatory message from Netanyahu. That really irked Trump, because Trump is vehement that the election was stolen. Number two, in the killing of Soleimani, it was supposed to be a joint operation, and Jerusalem pulled out the last second, and that really irritated Trump, and left the United States doing doing the job by itself.
Right.
So it goes on, and so basically what Netanyahu does is create these problems for the United States. Knows he has the U.S. locked in, and then he wants the U.S. to fight its wars and handle its problems, particularly on the military side. Now, for the first time, Israel for a year now is experiencing war directly. They've never experienced conflict for this long internally, and now people are really beginning to get tired. And I'm seeing increasingly the possibility that people are going to get more and more irritated with Netanyahu himself, and because they cannot go on and sustain this, their economy is in the toilet, and I think that as long as this continues with these wars, Netanyahu's popularity is going to wane even further, but because they haven't really accomplished what they set out to do. Now they defeated Hamas militarily, but they haven't extinguished it, and that's what they want to do, and it's not going to happen. Just not going to happen.
Hamas is still fighting in Gaza. I mean, it may be pinpricks, but they're still fighting in Gaza. Apparently, in the West Bank, it started to blow up because again they're trying to annex the West Bank, and the settlers have gone on a killing spree. Hezbollah, even though they might have decapitated the heads of Hezbollah, they're still fighling. In fact,
they have replacements already. That's how they train.
Yeah, the missile strikes that have basically just like hit Tel Aviv, Haifa, the Ashdod military bases. I mean, meaning they're still launching and fighting in that sense.
Sure.
And Iran has effectively said they're going to launch attacks on Israel, what they call True Promise 3, that they're effectively preparing for those attacks, and that they may escalate to the point of developing nuclear weapons. This is like an astonishing outcome, all of this stuff being pushed by Israel. One last point. I want to get your take on the arrest warrant for Netanyahu. And before I get your take on it, I want to play you Netanyahu's response to having the ICC issue the arrest warrant. I hate this clip, but I'm going to play it anyway, purely for the audience and purely for your analysis of it. But this is Netanyahu referring to the International Criminal Court arrest warrant regarding crimes against humanity.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. 130 years ago, the French Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason by a biased French court. In response to these false accusations, the great French writer Émile Zola wrote his monumental essay, J'accuse. He accused the French court of anti-Semitic lies against an innocent officer who was later exonerated of all guilt. Now an international court in The Hague, also headed by a French judge, is repeating this outrageous offense. It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected prime minister of the state of Israel, and Israel's former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualties. We issue millions of text messages, phone calls, leaflets to the citizens of Gaza to get them out of harm's way, while the Hamas terrorists do everything in their power to keep them in harm's way, including shooting them, using them as human shields. The court in The Hague accuses us of a deliberate policy of starvation. This when we've supplied Gaza with 700,000 tons of food to feed the people of Gaza. That's 3,200 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. And these supplies are routinely looted by Hamas terrorists who deprive their people.
I'm going to stop that there because it gives you the flavor of what he's trying to do.
It's obnoxious on its face, and it defies history. He tries to equate himself as a victim, like Dreyfus was. It's comparing apples with oranges. Once again, he's a professional victim. He wants to be the professional victim. During the period of Dreyfus, they didn't have the communications that we have today, and everybody sees for themselves what's going on the battlefield and the wanton slaughter of more than 40,000 innocent women and children and elderly Palestinians. and also in Lebanon now. So he can equate opposition to Israel as anti-Semitic, but as a Semite myself, and I oppose Israeli moves, it's going to be hard for them to accuse me of being an anti-Semitic. I hate the policies. I hate what he's doing, and it's not because he's Jewish. It's because he's slaughtering innocent people, and he's no better than the Nazis were.
Yeah, I agree with you on this. I mean, I've seen shooting kids in the back. I've seen them throwing people off of rooftops. I mean, just astonishing stuff. The starvation, and even the U.S. From the U.S.'s point of view, when they pointed out, they said you have 30 days to do something about basically the starvation that's taking place in Gaza. Okay, well, the U.S. wouldn't have to say that if indeed the people were eating and getting food and resources that they were supposed to get their hands on.
Yeah, they weren't getting them.
They weren't getting it.
Yeah,
it's against our own laws to allow Israel. And yet we continue to back them and give them a blank check on the stuff.
See, on the ground, the Palestinians themselves have a fundamental problem. How can you be calling to feed us on the one hand, but then giving the bombs to the Israelis? They've said, we want nothing to do with the United States.
Right.
And that can go on for generations now. And that is the impression that the world is coming to, in conclusion, that the world is coming to toward the United States in light of this support for Israel. Israel is taking us down with them, and that is wrong. If we're going to look at the Middle East, we need to look at it independently of those countries. At those countries independently, and not through the prism constantly of Israel. It's got to stop.
Agreed. I've asked this question to many analysts who've come on and talked about this issue. How do you think this ultimately resolves? Meaning, what do you think this looks like at the very end of it on the ground?
Unless Netanyahu is taken out and fast, I see this expanding further. He has designs to go into Iran that will bring in Russia and China. And I think that's when you're going to see the beginning of the end of Israel as a state, nation state.
Do you think Donald Trump would back him in these attacks?
I ultimately think not. I think he will try to convince him to stand down, but because Netanyahu wants to retain power at all costs, because if he doesn't, he loses his political support with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and that will then bring down his government, and he cannot afford to do that. He has a majority in the Knesset, but he hasn't gotten them yet to exempt him from prosecution. If he can get them to do that, then I see him resigning tomorrow.
What did you say? They slap him. Well, he's supposed to go to court on the 2nd of December. He tried to get
he's got to hurry.
He's screwed. They're going to put him in a cage.
Exactly.
And man, I am going to wait for that day to see him dragged away in cuffs and put into a cage. Michael, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Michael Maloof. He is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense, and he is a friend of this show that is greatly appreciated. Thank you, man. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Jamar. Have a good day.
You too.